my name's Lizzie. I'm Anglican, and in 3 weeks tomorrow even, oh my goodness, I'm going to be moving into a convent ready to become a postulant. I thought it was about time I did a video kind of explaining what specifically made me feel called to religious life or to a particular religious community, so this is me finally making that video. And there are actually quite a few videos like this on YouTube. If you do a YouTube search for vocation story, that tends to bring them up, of different sisters talking about what brought them to feeling called to religious life. So this is me just telling my story in my own words. And in order for me to be able to do that, I know I'm gonna end up using certain kind of church phrases. So I'm really sorry if I end up using a few phrases that you're not familiar with, and I just trust that you'll bear with me and just Google anything that you're not familiar with if it interests you, because if I try and explain every kind of church phrase that I use in this video, it will just take 3 times as long and be quite disruptive. So thank you for bearing with me, and this is me trying to tell my story of what specifically made me feel called to religious life, or what happened on a particular day that I'd like to talk to you about that kind of made so much difference in this discernment story.
I will hold your people in my heart.
Sorry this video is a bit dark, by the way. My laptop seems to have given up wanting to record without freezing, so I'm trying to record on a phone. Right, so this video kind of starts where some of my previous videos all meet. So I talked in one of them about how I had a boyfriend for a while, and although this was at a time where I sensed that God wanted to do something new in my life, and I had suspected for years that I was called to live on my own, and then I met this guy at work, and I was wondering if God was actually calling me to marriage after all. But the more I thought about the reality of going down that route, the more I felt that marriage wasn't actually my vocation, or that if I went down that route I would be missing out on my true vocation. But it was also while I was with him that, and thinking about these things and praying about these things, that I realised that it's actually when you love somebody you're willing to make compromises. And I realised that if I love Jesus that much, that I'm actually willing to make compromises and do things I previously wouldn't have been happy about or found comfortable. And the analogy of a husband and wife joining their possessions together and moving in with each other was really useful for me in realising that actually, if that's what God wanted, I would be happy to move into a religious community and let go of a lot of my own possessions and a lot of my own choices. So it played a big part in this journey. At the same time, I've tried to tell the story in a few videos of how, while I was training to be a priest, I felt that wasn't quite where God wanted me, and I had this growing sense of how I felt God wanted to form me. And it was over those years that I increasingly felt called to a certain kind of spirituality that I found most in reading books more in the spirituality section of the library rather than theology, and that I found most in Anglo-Catholic spirituality or Catholic spirituality, and also especially like mystic spirituality. And I found myself reading a lot about by people in religious life and about religious life, and just found a depth there that I couldn't find anywhere else. And like I've said in other videos, I've felt this affinity with religious life for years and years, and quite often I suspected that I might be called to religious life in the future, like maybe at a later date, like later on in my life, like my 50s or 60s or something. I suspected that I might be called to religious life, or I wondered if the Church of England would form a new traditional monastic community that was a bit more Anglo-Catholic but aimed at younger people, but that was traditional, not new monasticism. So I suspected that maybe religious life was for me, but not yet, or something like that. And then all at the same time, another thing that sort of leads into this video is the fact that our previous Anglo-Catholic priest retired a couple of years ago, and I just noticed this, or I felt like I noticed this pattern in the Church of England of there being more and more evangelicals in the Church of England, or the Church of England becoming more evangelical overall, or diocese having a more evangelical flavour. I might be wrong about that, but this was kind of how it felt, and I felt like I saw this pattern of churches that used to be more Anglo-Catholic being made slightly less Anglo-Catholic over time. And so this video begins on a day when I was praying about all of this and wondering like where my future was as someone who's young and more on the Catholic side of the Church of England, because when I say I'm more Catholic, it's not because I care about like vestments and candles and incense and things, or that I want services to be formal or traditional. It's the actual spirituality of Catholic spirituality and the theology of Catholic theology that I find a real depth in. Like, I used to be a lot more evangelical, but it's actually, I find much more spiritual depth in the more Catholic spirituality and theology. So I was just wondering if the very things that I find the most spiritual depth in are the very things that seem to be gradually either being watered down or left to one side in the Church of England. Like, where is there for me to find like a spiritual home, or to be fed spiritually in the way that I'd been able to be fed previously by Anglo-Catholic priests? And I was noticing things like certain things that I'd really benefited from the past, like the priest preaching about sacraments more, things like confession or sacrament of reconciliation. These things seem to be like dying out in the churches that I was most familiar with. We had a few quiet days where the priest brought out a monstrance, and we had kind of silent adoration in front of the sacrament as part of that quiet day, and I found those kind of things really spiritually powerful, and these were the things that seem to be like dying out in my own city somehow. And so there was a Sunday afternoon where I was praying about all of this, saying to God, these kinds of things where I find the most spiritual depth feel like they're not dying out, but getting harder to find within the Church of England, and harder to find in this city. And it had got to the point where, for various reasons, like maybe all of this, and maybe that God had put this inside me, but on this particular afternoon I just felt like my time in this city had naturally come to an end. And so, thinking about all these things that I had just described, about maybe I am called to religious life, or maybe God does want to do something new at this moment in my life, and maybe my time in Leicester has come to an end, I basically said to God, look, you know that I find the most spiritual depth in more Catholic spirituality and theology, and you know that I'm passionate about sharing the things that I find spiritually deep with other people, and you know the future of the Church of England and what you want to do in it, and you know that the things that I've previously found really spiritually helpful and deep are getting harder to find. And I said, I feel like I'm not called to marriage, which means that I'm kind of here ready to be sent wherever, like literally anywhere in the world you want me to go, and you know that I don't mind however like rough or poor the life that you want me to live for the sake of others. So I basically said I said to God, like from the bottom of my heart, please please can you put me somewhere where I can both be fed spiritually with the kind of spiritual depth that I most resonate with, which tends to be like the traditional wisdom of the church and the more Catholic spirituality and theology and things. But I basically said, like, please put me where I can be most fed spiritually and where I can help feed others spiritually, and where I can be of most use to the church and to the kingdom of God. That was basically my prayer. And on that particular afternoon, when I'd finished praying that prayer, I was reminded of, I'd been watching some documentaries, what was it, One Born Every Minute, of like ladies in labour, and then like the whole giving birth thing. Because I've had friends recently who've had children, so I was like watching the documentaries to educate myself. And there comes a moment in a lot of these documentaries where the midwife or whoever says, like, you've only got like 1 or 2 more contractions or pushes left, and then the baby will be born. And I felt God saying to me, like, you've been on this really, really long journey, like discernment journey, like a long labour. And I felt God say to me on this particular afternoon when I was praying in my flat, kind of like the next push, or in a very short while, you will see the face of your vocation. Because I'd also said in this prayer that I still didn't feel like I was fully where God ultimately wanted me in terms of my vocation. So that was what I felt God saying to me after I'd prayed this prayer, that in not very long at all, I would see the face of my vocation. So I left the prayer time like that. And then that evening, this was a Sunday afternoon, that Sunday evening, I thought, well, that my church no longer has what you might call a holy hour or exposition or adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. So what I'll do, I'll go to the Roman Catholic Church nearby, which is also a Dominican priory, and I'll go to their holy hour instead. So I went to their holy hour, and it was different from the more like silent adoration that I'm used to, but I appreciated at least being somewhere where they had such a thing as a holy hour. And I didn't necessarily feel God saying anything to me during this hour, although I noticed that there were some Dominican friars who started leading the worship at one point, and so obviously that then kind of put religious life back in my head again, but I didn't like necessarily think anything of it. I just sort of noticed them. I didn't necessarily feel at that moment while I was looking at them like God kind of calling me to religious life. So I went to this holy hour, didn't necessarily feel God saying anything to me, but the minute I got home, for some reason I just opened my laptop and started searching for more Anglo-Catholic religious communities that I knew were okay with women priests, because I just didn't feel like I would ever fit in one that wasn't okay with female priests. So I googled a particular community that I was already aware of from a city I used to live in, and so I was looking around their website thinking, but there wasn't any kind of deep connection with it. And I texted my dad, who was kind of a bit familiar with this community, and I said, like, what do you know about this community? Could you see me there, or did you think God might be calling me there? And then my dad texted back going, what about this other community in this other place in the country? And I didn't really remember ever reading about it, although I must have done in that Anglican Religious Life book that I've mentioned in other videos that has all the Anglican communities in the country in it. So this community was basically one that my dad had heard of over tea and coffee after one service a few years ago. Just somebody had mentioned to him in passing, oh, my cousin is a sister at this particular community in this particular city. So my dad just texted me saying, what about this community? So it turns out that he's on his laptop at home and I'm on my laptop at home. So we both look for the website of this other community, then I find their Facebook page as well. And then my dad and I both found the same particular page of their website, and we were both texting each other saying, like, oh my goodness, do you see what I see? This is so you. And I almost fell off my sofa kind of with surprise, or with that overwhelming feeling of oh my goodness, this is precisely the kind of thing that I felt called to for years. Because I'd looked at so many different religious communities and just not felt it was quite what I was called to. And I'd, in the back of my mind, I'd always wondered if I was called to religious life, but I had to find a community that I felt called to. But this was the first time in all these years that I felt, actually, I think God might be calling me to this specific community. But because it's so much more, what I feel called to, and just so much more me somehow. So then the next day I then emailed the community and I said, I know that I'm quite young in the grand scheme of a lot of sisters in religious life. And I basically just kind of explained that I trained to be a priest 10 years ago and I felt it wasn't quite my vocation. I've been sort of feeling an affinity for religious life for years, and kind of living like a nun myself for years, and feeling called to certain forms of prayer combined with action. And I said that I've got a feeling that God might actually be calling me to your community. And then I got a reply back saying, thank you for your email, it was really interesting, and please come and visit our community just as a guest and stay in the guest accommodation. And I forgot to say, well, before I got this reply, just the day that I sent off the email, I felt such this extremely deep peace, like I don't think I've ever felt before in my life, that I had done the right thing and that this was right somehow. So I just thought I'd better mention that too. So then I get a reply a few days later saying, like, thank you, and it was very interesting, and please come and stay as a guest. And then right at the end of the email, the sister who was writing to me said, oh, and by the way, to help you on your way, please know that we've just admitted a postulant the same age as you only a few weeks ago. And it turned out that, as I mentioned a bit in another video, that a young lady the same age as me had also felt called to this community. And so my email came to this community about 3 weeks into her being a postulant. So at that moment I felt extremely encouraged, and I thought, I think God's up to something.